Imagine this. The winter of 1944. Snow blankets the Ardennes forest. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by the roar of nearly 500,000 German soldiers and thousands of tanks. This is Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. The goal? To smash through the American lines, race to the coast, and split the Allied armies in two. A bold, audacious plan that, if successful, could have changed the course of the war. But this colossal war machine had a fatal flaw, a secret weakness hidden in plain sight. It was running on fumes. From the very beginning, German logisticians were sounding the alarm. They looked at the numbers, the sheer scale of the offensive, and came to a chilling conclusion. There simply wasn't enough fuel. The panzers, the trucks, the entire mechanized fist of the Wehrmacht was built on a foundation of empty promises and rapidly dwindling reserves. They warned Hitler directly, presenting him with the cold, hard facts. An operation of this magnitude required a massive, uninterrupted supply of gasoline, something Germany, battered by years of Allied bombing on its synthetic fuel plants, no longer had a. But Hitler waved away their concerns. He was a man driven by ideology and sheer force of will, often ignoring the practical realities of warfare. He believed in the power of a single, decisive blow. Speed, surprise, and the fighting spirit of his soldiers would carry the day. He argued the panzers would simply have to capture Allied fuel dumps along the way. It was a plan built not on logistics, but on luck. He was betting the entire Western Front on a scavenger hunt for gasoline. This gamble became the central drama of the Battle of the Bulge. The German spearheads weren't just fighting American soldiers. They were fighting their own fuel gauges. Every kilometer they advanced, every hour they idled their engines, they were bleeding their most precious resource. The elite SS Panzer divisions, like Kampfgruppe Paper, were given priority for what little fuel was available. Their mission was to break through and seize the massive Allied fuel depot at Spa, Belgium. Capturing it wasn't just a strategic objective. It was a matter of survival for the entire offensive. So, you have this incredible scene. Some of the most powerful tanks of the war, the fearsome King Tigers and Panthers, pushing relentlessly forward. But their crews knew that if they didn't capture fuel soon, their steel beasts would become nothing more than immobile iron coffins. The offensive became a desperate race against time. German columns would bypass pockets of American resistance, not always for tactical reasons, but because they couldn't afford to waste fuel in a prolonged fight. One of the most critical moments came near the town of Stavelot. Here Kampfgruppe Piper stumbled upon a massive American fuel dump. It was their golden ticket, the prize they desperately needed. But in a series of chaotic skirmishes, American engineers managed to set the depot ablaze. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of precious gasoline went up in smoke, a towering black plume visible for miles. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe. They had come so close, only to watch their salvation burn before their very eyes. The story of the 50,000 gallons at Stavelot is a perfect example of this logistical nightmare. Before the Germans could secure the entire town, a small group of American engineers found a dump containing roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel. Thinking fast, they opened the valves, pouring the gasoline into the streets and setting it on fire. The river of fire not only denied the fuel to the advancing panzers, but also created a formidable barrier, halting their advance. This single act of defiance, born of desperation, had an outsized impact on the battle. Without captured fuel, the German advance began to sputter. Tanks ran dry in the middle of roads and were abandoned by their crews. Supply trucks couldn't reach the front lines. The powerful armored spearhead that was supposed to shatter the Allied front was slowly grinding to a halt, not just from American resistance, but from starvation. The fuel crisis rippled through the entire German army in the Ardennes. Hitler's grand ambition, his vision of a lightning strike to the coast, was dissolving in the snows of Belgium. The Wehrmacht had the soldiers, they had the tanks, and they had the initial element of surprise. But they didn't have the gas. It's a powerful lesson in military history. Courage and steel are useless without the fuel to move them. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just decided by brave soldiers fighting in frozen foxholes, but also by the unsung heroes who destroyed fuel dumps and the simple, undeniable math of logistics. By Christmas 1944, the tide had turned. With clear skies, Allied air power returned to the battlefield, hammering the stalled German columns and their fragile supply lines. The German offensive had shot its bolt. The panzers that were meant to be in Antwerp were instead abandoned and rusting in the Ardennes. Hitler's final gamble had failed, and the empty fuel tanks of his panzer divisions were a silent testament to a plan that was doomed from the start. It shows that even the most ambitious military operations can be defeated by something as mundane as an empty gas can. This episode reveals the critical importance of logistics in modern warfare. It's not as glamorous as tank battles or daring infantry charges, but it is the bedrock upon which victory is built. The German failure in the Ardennes is a textbook case study. They had one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, but they ignored the fundamental rules of supply and demand. In the end, the road to Antwerp was not blocked solely by American GIs, but by the hubris of a leader who believed willpower could overcome an empty fuel tank. In the freezing cold of December 1944, a desperate gamble was about to unfold. Hitler, believing he could still turn the tide of the war, unleashed his last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious, aiming to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. At the very tip of the steel spear was a unit renowned for its ferocity and effectiveness, Kampftruppe, led by the charismatic and ruthless SS-Oberst Banfer Joachim Peiper. This battle group was carved from the heart of the elite 1st SS Panzer Division. They were the best of the best, a hardened force equipped with Germany's most fearsome late-war technology. Imagine the sight. The ground trembling under the weight of the colossal Tiger II tanks. Their 88mm guns capable of knocking out any Allied armor from extreme distances. Alongside them rumbled the formidable Panther tanks, a deadly combination of speed, armor, and firepower. The column was fleshed out with Panzer IVs, self-propelled guns, and half-tracks packed with veteran Panzer. On paper, it was an unstoppable force, a steel fist ready to punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. But this intimidating display of power hid a fatal weakness, a secret that would doom the offensive from its very first moments. The German war machine was running on empty. According to the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Kampftruppe rolled towards the front lines with a shockingly low amount of fuel. They had enough for perhaps one single day of intense, full-throttle combat. One day, their entire strategy wasn't just based on a swift breakthrough. It was utterly dependent on capturing Allied fuel dumps along their route of advance. It was a high-stakes poker game where Germany had gone all in, betting the fate of the Western Front on the hope of running their war on their enemy's gasoline. The plan was for Peiper to lead the charge, smashing through the American 99th Infantry Division, crossing the Meuse River, and then racing towards Antwerp. The northern shoulder of the Ardennes was chosen specifically for its road network, which was crucial for a rapid armored advance. The initial German artillery barrage on December 16th was thunderous, designed to shatter the morale and cohesion of the American defenders. As dawn broke, Peiper's panzers began to move, their engines roaring in the crisp winter air. The element of surprise was total. The American troops, many of whom were green and battle-weary, were caught completely off guard. They had believed the Ardennes was a ghost front, a quiet sector to rest and refit. They were about to face the full fury of the Waffen-SS. In the initial hours, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Peiper's column steamrolled through the first lines of American resistance. The sheer shock and awe of the Tiger Eye is. And Panthers sent shockwaves through the American ranks. Small outposts were overrun, communication lines were cut, and a sense of panic began to spread. The Germans were advancing with brutal efficiency, but the cracks were already starting to show. The terrain of the Ardennes, with its narrow, winding roads, dense forests, and steep hills, was not ideal tank country. It channeled the powerful German formation into predictable paths, creating bottlenecks and slowing the advance to a crawl. A single well-placed anti-tank gun or a destroyed bridge could hold up the entire column for hours. And American soldiers, though initially shocked, began to fight back with incredible tenacity. Small groups of GIs, isolated and often outnumbered, used the terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes and roadblocks. They knew they couldn't stop the German juggernaut, but they could delay it. And for Kampftruppe, every hour of delay was another hour burning precious, irreplaceable fuel. The fuel gauges in the panzers were like hourglasses, ticking down on the entire operation. One of the most famous examples of this desperate American defense occurred at the small village of A single platoon of American infantry, led by Lieutenant Lyle Bocock, held a critical ridge against overwhelming odds. For an entire day, these few men held off a much larger German force, disrupting the timetable for Puper's advance significantly. This single action had a ripple effect, causing traffic jams that stretched 4 miles behind the German lines. The spearhead was getting blunted before it could even build up momentum. Meanwhile, Piper himself was becoming increasingly frustrated. He was a man of action, and the slow, grinding advance was not what he had envisioned. He pushed his men and machines relentlessly, bypassing pockets of resistance whenever possible, always with his eyes on the next objective and, more importantly, the next potential fuel source. This single-minded focus led to one of the most infamous and dark events of the battle, the Montmedy massacre. Near the Bogness crossroads, Piper's men captured over 100 American soldiers. In a shocking act of brutality, the prisoners were The exact reasons remain debated, but the act cemented Piper's brutal reputation and strengthened Allied resolve to stop him at all costs. As Piper's Kampfgruppe pushed deeper, the logistical nightmare worsened. The narrow roads became clogged with wrecked vehicles and German supply trucks struggling to keep up. The weather, which had initially favored the Germans by grounding Allied air power, was a double-edged sword. The mud and snow turned roads into quagmires, further slowing the advance and consuming even more fuel. The gamble was failing. The critical Allied fuel dumps they had banked on capturing remained just out of reach, often being blown up by retreating American engineers just moments before the German tanks arrived. The turning point came at the town of Stavelot and the bridge over the Amblève River. Here, American combat engineers performed heroics, blowing the bridges just as Piper's lead tanks approached. Without these bridges, Piper was forced into a detour, funneling his entire battle group into the narrow, winding Amblève River valley. It was a trap. He had advanced deep into enemy territory, but his path forward was blocked, and his line of retreat was tenuous. His fuel tanks were nearly dry. Die mighty Kampfgruppe, the powerful steel fist, was now isolated and surrounded. The hunter had become the hunt. Now, the tables turned completely. The weather cleared, and the dreaded Allied fighter-bombers, the Jabos, returned to the skies. They wreaked havoc on the exposed German column trapped in the valley, picking off tanks and trucks with rockets and bombs. American artillery zeroed in on their positions, raining down a constant barrage of shells. Piper's men, low on ammunition, food, and, critically, fuel, could do little but dig in and endure the onslaught. The elite SS panzer crews were reduced to fighting as infantry. Realizing his position was hopeless, Piper made a final, desperate decision. On December 23rd, under the cover of darkness, he ordered his remaining men to abandon their vehicles. They were to destroy their precious Tiger and Panther tanks, their half-tracks, and all their heavy equipment. The pride of the Panzerwaffe was to be scuttled. About 800 men, a fraction of the original force, began a grueling escape on foot, trying to make their way back to German lines through the snow-covered forests, all while being hunted by American patrols. They had failed to cross the Meuse, failed to capture any significant fuel supplies, and had failed to break the Allied line. The spearhead was broken. The story of Kampfgruppe Piper is a microcosm of the entire Battle of the Bulge. It's a story of incredible initial success built on a foundation of logistical desperation. It showcases the immense power of Germany's late-war armor, but also highlights its fatal flaws: mechanical unreliability and voracious fuel consumption. It's a testament to the bravery and resilience of the American soldiers who, despite being surprised and outgunned, refused to break and ultimately stalled the most dangerous German thrust of the offensive. The trail of abandoned, silent steel left in the Amblève Valley was a powerful symbol. It was the wreckage not just of a battle group, but of Hitler's final, desperate hope for victory in the West. On December 16, 1944, under the shroud of a harsh winter, the German war machine made its last great gamble in the West. This was the Battle of the Bulge. And at the very tip of its spear, a unit that would become infamous, Kampfgruppe Piper, led by the ruthless SS officer Joachim Peiper. Their objective was audacious: to punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp, splitting the Allied forces in two. To do this, they were equipped with some of the most fearsome tanks of the war, the mighty Tiger IEs and Panthers. On paper, they were an unstoppable iron fist. But this iron fist had a hidden, fatal weakness. A weakness measured in gallons. Peiper's column was a terrifying sight. Nearly 100 tanks and armored vehicles, supported by thousands of soldiers, thundered through the Ardennes forest. Their initial breakthrough was shocking. They smashed through surprised, thinly spread American defenses. Take the town of Honsfeld. When Peiper's forces rolled in, they seemed invincible. They captured the town swiftly, along with a treasure trove of American supplies and, crucially, fuel. This early success created an illusion of overwhelming power. The speed was breathtaking. They didn't just capture towns, they blitzed through them, barely slowing down. But this wasn't a strategic choice born from confidence. It was an act of sheer desperation. You see, Hitler's grand plan had a catastrophic flaw. The German High Command knew they didn't have enough fuel to get to Antwerp. Not even close. The entire offensive was predicated on a wild gamble that they could capture Allied fuel dumps along the way. Think about that. The success of one of the most ambitious military operations in history depended entirely on stealing gas from the enemy. There were no reliable German fuel convoys trailing Peiper's tanks. Every single gallon burned had to be replaced by what they could find. This turned their lightning advance into a frantic, high-stakes race against their own fuel gauges. They couldn't stop. They couldn't pause to consolidate their gains or rest their crews. Every minute spent idle was a minute closer to becoming a sitting duck. The tanks had to keep rolling, or they would be stranded, their powerful guns useless without the engine's roar. This desperate need for fuel explains the brutality and the frantic pace of Peiper's advance. They couldn't afford to engage in prolonged battles. They had to bypass strong points and push ever onward, hoping the next village, the next crossroads, would hold the gasoline they so desperately needed. In Lanzareth, a small group of American soldiers held up the entire German column for a critical day, a delay that cost Peiper dearly in both time and fuel. When they finally broke through, their frustration and desperation boiled over, leading to atrocities like the Montmedy massacre, where captured American soldiers were executed. This wasn't just mindless cruelty, it was the act of a unit that believed it couldn't be slowed down, couldn't be burdened with prisoners, because the clock was ticking and the fuel tanks were running dry. Imagine being a tanker in one of those Panthers or Tigers. You're inside one of the most powerful fighting machines on Earth, capable of destroying anything in your path. Yet, your biggest enemy isn't the American soldier with a bazooka. It's that little needle on the fuel gauge. Slowly, relentlessly, dropping towards empty. Every rumble of the engine is a countdown to impotence. The forest roads of the Ardennes, narrow and winding, became a claustrophobic trap. A single knocked-out vehicle could block the entire column, burning precious fuel as the others sat idle. The pressure on the crews must have been immense. They were told they were the elite, the spearhead of a victorious charge. But in reality, they were living on borrowed time and captured fuel. As Peiper pushed deeper into American territory, the situation became more and more critical. They did capture some fuel, like at Bullingen, which allowed them to continue their mad dash. But it was never enough. They were like a shark that had to keep swimming to breathe. Peiper's panzers had to keep moving to fight. Their route was dictated not by the best tactical positions, but by the rumored locations of Allied fuel dumps. They bypassed crucial objectives in their hunt for gasoline. The entire axis of their advance was warped by this single, overriding need. They were drawn towards the town of Stavelot, not just because it was on their path, but because it was rumored to hold a massive American fuel depot. The battle for Stavelot and the nearby bridge at Trois became the turning point. Here, the American resistance stiffened. Engineers blew up key bridges just as the German vanguard approached. At Stavelot, American troops fought fiercely to retake the town and, more importantly, to deny the Germans the fuel dump. Peiper's men managed to seize part of the town, but they couldn't secure the fuel. They were tantalizingly close. They could probably smell the gasoline that would have carried them to the Meuse River, and perhaps to victory. But they couldn't get to it. This was the beginning of the end for Kampfrupp-Peiper. Cut off, surrounded, and with their fuel tanks now practically empty, the mighty panzer spearhead ground to a halt near the village of La Gliese. The fearsome Tiger II tanks, each a 70-ton fortress of steel, were now nothing more than static pillboxes. They had run out of gas. For days they held out, hoping for relief that would never come. The Hunters had become the American artillery pounded their positions relentlessly. Finally, Peiper received the order to break out. But he couldn't take his vehicles. On Christmas Eve, 1944, Peiper and his remaining men abandoned their tanks, their armored vehicles, and their heavy equipment. They destroyed what they could and slipped away on foot, back through the snow-covered forests they had thundered through just a week earlier. Of the nearly 4,000 men who started the attack, only about 800 made it back. They left behind a graveyard of some of the most advanced military technology of the time. Dozens of Panthers, Tigers, and other vehicles were littered across the Belgian countryside, abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because of an empty fuel tank. It's a stunning testament to the importance of logistics in warfare. You can have the best soldiers and the best tanks in the world, but if you can't supply them, they are worthless. The story of Kampfrupp-Peiper is often told as a tale of ruthless determination, but it's more accurately a story of logistical suicide. A desperate gamble built on hope instead of a solid plan. It shows that the most powerful weapon of war isn't always a cannon or a bomb. Sometimes, it's something as simple and as vital as a gallon of fuel. The ghost of Peiper's panzers, silent in the Ardennes snow, serves as a powerful lesson that still echoes in military strategy today. The Allies were caught off guard. Their lines stretched thin, and the initial reports painted a grim picture of chaos and retreat. But what looked like a panicked withdrawal was, in many places, a carefully orchestrated fighting retreat. This wasn't just about survival. It was about bleeding the German war machine dry. 1 mile, 1 bridge, 1 gallon of fuel at a time. This is the story of the Allied delay and deny strategia. Desperate, brilliant, and ultimately successful gamble to turn the tide of the battle. When the German tanks of the 6th Panzer Army, led by the infamous SSO Joachim Peiper, smashed through the American lines, their objective was clear: race to the Meuse River, severing the Allied forces and paving the way for a decisive victory. Their plan hinged on one critical factor: speed. And speed, for a mechanized army, meant fuel. The German High Command knew their own supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. They were counting on capturing massive Allied fuel dumps along their route. Without that captured gasoline, their powerful panzer tanks would become little more than 30-ton steel coffins, sitting ducks for Allied air power and anti-tank guns. This is where the Allied strategy truly began to shine. As American units were forced to fall back, they weren't just running for their lives. On orders from High Command, they began a systematic campaign of destruction. Every bridge that could be blown was blown. Every road that could be blocked with mines or felled trees was blocked. And most importantly, every fuel and supply depot that couldn't be evacuated was set ablaze. The goal was simple: deny the enemy everything, make them fight for every inch of ground, and burn their own precious fuel to do it. Imagine the scene: small groups of American engineers, often under heavy fire, working frantically with explosives to drop a stone bridge into a ravine, just moments before the lead German tanks rumbled into view. G's using their own jeeps and trucks to create roadblocks, then setting them on fire, and the skies filled with the black, greasy smoke of burning gasoline, as thousands upon thousands of gallons were intentionally torched to keep them from enemy hands. This strategy was incredibly costly. It meant abandoning valuable equipment and supplies. But the Allied commanders understood the bigger picture. Every gallon of fuel the Germans had to burn from their own limited reserves was a small victory. Every hour they were delayed was another hour for reinforcements to be rushed to the front. This brings us to the crucial town of Stavelot in Belgium. Nestled in a valley along the Amblève River, Stavelot was directly in the path of Peiper's Kampfrupp, and just outside the town lay one of the largest American fuel depots in the entire region, a prize of almost unimaginable value to the fuel-starved panzers. We're talking about millions of gallons of gasoline, enough to fuel Peiper's entire spearhead all the way to the Meuse and beyond. The Germans knew it was there. Capturing it was not just a priority, it was essential for the success of their entire offensive. As Piper's force approached on December 18, 1944, Stavelot was defended by a hodgepodge of American units, primarily engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These weren't frontline infantrymen. They were builders, not brawlers. But on that day, they became heroes. They knew what was at stake. As the lead elements of the SS Panzer Division entered Stavelot, the engineers put up a ferocious defense. They used everything they had: rifles, machine guns, and their extensive knowledge of explosives too, turned the town into a deadly labyrinth. While the battle for Stavelot raged in the streets, a small detachment of engineers had a different, even more critical mission. They had to get to the fuel depot and destroy it. It was a race against time. The sound of tank treads and machine gun fire echoed through the valley as they worked. They weren't just fighting for a town, they were fighting to deny the German army its lifeblood. The Germans pushed into Stavelot with brutal efficiency, and for a short time it seemed they had succeeded. They secured the town and the bridge over the Amblave, and their path to the fuel depot seemed open. But the American resistance had bought just enough time. As the German panzers refueled from their own nearly empty tanks and prepared to push on towards the depot, the American engineers completed their task. A series of massive explosions rocked the valley as the depot went up in flames. Eyewitness accounts describe a sea of fire, a massive inferno that lit up the night sky for miles around. The black smoke was a beacon of defiance. Millions of gallons of gasoline burned, turning into a thick, black cloud that symbolized the failure of the German plan. For Joachim Piper and his Kampftrupp, it was a devastating blow. They had fought their way into Stavelot, only to watch their salvation turn to ash before their eyes. Stuck on the western side of the town with dwindling fuel, their lightning advance began to sputter. They were forced to try and find other routes, consuming more of their precious fuel and giving the Allies more time to solidify their defenses. The destruction of the Stavelot fuel depot was a critical turning point. It didn't stop the panzers in their tracks immediately, but it crippled their momentum and sealed their fate. The delay and deny strategy, executed with courage and sacrifice by countless soldiers and engineers, worked perfectly. The German offensive, which relied so heavily on speed and captured supplies, literally ran out of gas. In the days that followed, Piper's trapped and fuel-starved Kampftrupp was systematically hunted down and destroyed in the forests and valleys of the Ardennes. The great German gamble had failed, in no small part due to the black smoke rising from a burning fuel depot near a small Belgian town. The bravery of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion at Stavelot is a testament to the fact that wars are unjust won by frontline infantry. They are won by logistics, by strategy, and by the courage of soldiers from all branches who understand the mission and are willing to do whatever it takes to achieve it. By blowing bridges, blocking roads, and burning fuel, these men did more to stop the German advance than a dozen pitched battles might have. They turned Germany's greatest strength, its powerful panzer divisions, in its greatest weakness. This incredible story highlights the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Bulge. It shows that even in retreat, there can be victory. The delay and deny strategy was a painful one, requiring the destruction of valuable resources, but it was also a stroke of genius that saved the Allied front from collapsing. It's a powerful reminder that in warfare, sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a tank, but a well-executed plan and the resolve to see it through, no matter the cost. December 1944. The Ardennes forest is blanketed in snow, and the Allied forces are caught completely off guard. Hitler has just launched his last desperate gamble on the Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. The goal, to smash through the American lines, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Allies to sue for peace. Spearheading this audacious assault is Kampftrupp Piper, a powerful armored column led by the infamous SS officer Joachim Piper. His elite Panther and Tiger tanks are chewing up the thinly held American lines, creating panic and chaos. But Piper has a critical weakness, a problem that plagues the entire German war machine at this stage of the war: fuel. His tanks are thirsty, and without a constant supply of gasoline, his powerful offensive will grind to a halt long before he reaches his objective, the Meuse River. The German High Command knew this. Their entire plan was predicated on a lightning-fast advance that would capture Allied fuel dumps along the way. They were literally planning to run their war machine on their enemy's fuel. And near the small Belgian town of Stavelot, one of the largest fuel depots on the entire front, lay waiting. Records from the First U.S. Army show that this single depot contained an astonishing amount of gasoline. Some reports put the figure at over 2 million gallons. But even the most conservative estimates agree on a staggering number. Hundreds of thousands of gallons, more than enough to refuel Piper's entire panzer force, and then some. This depot wasn't just a prize. It was the key to the entire German offensive. If Piper's SS troopers could seize it, their tanks would have the range to thunder all the way to the Meuse and beyond. This single act could have dramatically altered the strategic balance of the Battle of the Bulge, and perhaps the entire war on the Western Front. The sleepy town of Stavelot was about to become the unlikely focal point of one of the most critical moments of the battle. As Piper's column advanced, it left a trail of destruction, most notoriously the Montmedy massacre. But their primary objective was always the fuel. They rolled into Stavelot on December 18th, pushing back the American defenders. The prize was tantalizingly close. The main fuel depot was located just on the other side of the Amblève River, which ran through the town. Piper's men secured a bridge and began to cross, their hopes soaring. They were on the verge of capturing the lifeblood they so desperately needed. The fate of the battle hung in the balance. A balance measured in gallons of gasoline. It was at this crucial juncture that the tide began to turn, thanks to the grit and determination of a handful of American soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake. The defense of Stavelot was a chaotic affair, a testament to the confusion of the early days of the Bulge. But among the defending units were elements of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These weren't frontline infantrymen. They were engineers. Their job was to build bridges, clear mines, and handle demolitions. And it was their expertise that would prove decisive. Realizing that the massive fuel dump was about to fall into enemy hands, these engineers made a bold and dangerous decision. They weren't going to let Piper have his fuel. Working under intense enemy fire, they began the perilous task of destroying the depot. They opened the valves on the massive storage tanks, letting thousands of gallons of gasoline pour out onto the ground. They doused the area with this highly flammable liquid and then set it ablaze. The result was an inferno of epic proportions. The sky turned orange as a massive fireball erupted, visible for miles around. Rivers of fire flowed through the streets as the burning gasoline sought low ground. The heat was so intense it buckled steel and melted asphalt. For Piper's men on the other side of the river, it was a devastating sight. They could only watch as the fuel they needed to win the battle went up in smoke, a colossal monument to their failure. They had come so close, but the quick thinking and raw courage of a few American engineers had denied them their prize. This act of defiance was a turning point. Without fuel, Piper's advance was doomed. He tried to push forward, seeking smaller fuel caches, but his momentum was gone. The Kampfrupp was now trapped, its powerful tanks becoming little more than static. American forces, now recovering from the initial shock of the attack, began to close the noose around him. Harassed from all sides, and with his fuel gauges on empty, Piper was forced to abandon his heavy equipment, including his prized Tiger II tanks. He and his remaining men had to retreat on foot, slipping back through the American lines they had so confidently smashed through just days before. The spearhead of the German offensive had been broken, not by a massive counterattack, but by a lack of gasoline. The destruction of the Stavelot fuel depot is one of the great what-ifs of the Second World War. What if Piper had captured it? With his tanks refueled, could he have reached the Meuse River? It's entirely possible. A successful crossing of the Meuse would have put the German army in a position to seriously threaten Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies and creating a strategic crisis of the highest order. It might not have won the war for Germany by late 1944. Their defeat was almost certainly inevitable. But it could have prolonged the conflict significantly, costing thousands more lives and altering the post-war map of Europe. The battle for a few 100,000 gallons of gasoline near a small Belgian town proved to be one of the most decisive engagements of the entire campaign. It demonstrates a fundamental truth of modern warfare. An army, no matter how powerful or well-armed, is useless if it can't move. The men of the 291st Engineer Battalion understood this. Their fiery, desperate act at Stavelot didn't just stop a panzer column, it helped save the Allied cause on the Western Front. It was a victory measured not in territory gained, but in fuel denied. This incredible story is a stark reminder of how seemingly small actions can have massive consequences in the chaos of war. It wasn't a general's master plan or a massive bombing raid that stopped Piper's charge. It was a group of engineers with courage and a few incendiary grenades. They saw the danger, understood the stakes, and acted decisively, turning the tide of the battle at its most critical moment. The inferno they unleashed at Stavelot became a funeral pyre for Hitler's last great hope in the West. The story of the Stavelot fuel dump is a testament to the ingenuity and bravery of the American soldier and a crucial, often overlooked chapter in the epic story of the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A brutal winter grips Europe, and the Allied forces believe the war is nearing its end. But Hitler, in a final, desperate gamble, launches a surprise offensive through the dense woods. This is the Battle of the Bulge, and at its heart lies a story of fuel, desperation, and a few good men standing against a tide of steel. Our story focuses on one-man SS Standartenführer Joachim Pape, commander of the lead element of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the spearhead of the German attack. His mission was audacious: punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. This would split the Allied armies, and, Hitler hoped, force them to the negotiating table. Piper's Kampfrupp was a formidable force, a rolling behemoth of King Tiger tanks, Panthers, and armored personnel carriers. On paper, it was unstoppable, but this metal monster had a fatal weakness, an Achilles heel that would dictate its every move: fuel consumption. A King Tiger tank drank gasoline like it was water, getting less than half a mile to the gallon. Piper started his offensive with his tanks only half full. He was literally running on fumes, gambling that he could capture Allied fuel supplies along the way. His famous motto for the offensive was, "The way is the goal." What he really meant was, "The fuel is the goal." The German plan was meticulously crafted. They knew the locations of major Allied fuel depots. Piper's route was a dotted line connecting these massive gas stations. His success, and the success of the entire Ardennes offensive, depended not just on breaking through enemy lines, but on capturing these fuel dumps intact. It was a high-stakes race against the fuel gauge. Initially, the gamble paid off. The surprise was total. Thinly stretched American units, caught completely off guard, were offered. Piper's column advanced rapidly, leaving a trail of destruction. They bypassed strongpoints, pushing ever westward, their eyes fixed on the Meuse. But as they advanced, their fuel tanks ran dangerously low. The American army, though reeling, was beginning to react. Small units, cut off and outnumbered, began to fight back with extraordinary courage. They knew they couldn't stop the German advance, but they could delay it. And every hour of delay meant more gasoline burned by Piper's thirsty tanks. This brings us to a small Belgian town called Stavelot. Nestled in the Amblave River Valley, Stavelot was unremarkable, except for one crucial detail. Just outside the town, a massive American fuel depot was located. Records from the 1st U.S. Army show this depot contained a staggering amount of gasoline. The exact number is debated by historians, but some accounts suggest over 2 million gallons were stored there. A significant portion, at least 50,000 gallons, was high-octane gasoline, perfect for Piper's Panzer. 50,000 gallons. To put that in perspective, it was more than enough to refuel Piper's entire armored column, not just to top them off, but to fill them to the brim. If the SS captured this prize, their tanks would have the range to Italy, reach the Meuse River, and beyond. The strategic balance of the entire Western Front could shift in a single moment. Stavelot, and its hidden ocean of fuel, had suddenly become one of the most critical points on the map. On the morning of December 18th, Piper's vanguard reached the outskirts of Stavelot. The town was defended by a handful of American engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. These weren't frontline infantry. They were builders, demolition experts, men who worked with dynamite and bulldozers, not tanks. They were lightly armed, massively outnumbered, and facing the elite of the Waffen-SS. What happened next was a testament to improvisation and sheer grit. As German tanks rumbled across the bridge into Stavelot, the engineers fought back with everything they had. They set up roadblocks, fired from windows, and turned the town's narrow streets into a deadly maze. Their fierce resistance shocked the Germans, who had expected to roll through unopposed. Piper himself was forced to commit more troops to clear the town, burning precious time and fuel. While the battle for Stavelot raged, a small group of engineers, led by a major, realized the true danger. The fuel depot. They knew that if Piper's tanks reached it, the game was over. They had to act fast. Under fire, they rushed to the depot. There was no time to evacuate the fuel. The only option was to destroy it. Picture the scene. American engineers, with German shells exploding around them, frantically working to deny the enemy his prize. They opened the spigots on the massive fuel drums, letting thousands of gallons pour onto the ground. They doused the area with gasoline, creating a massive, volatile lake of fuel. Then they set it ablaze. A colossal fireball erupted into the sky, a pillar of black smoke visible for miles. The roar was deafening as millions of dollars worth of fuel went up in flames. For Piper, hearing that explosion and seeing that column of smoke was the sound of his mission dying. He had come so close. His tanks were within sight of the depot, their engines sputtering, their crews desperate for the fuel that was now burning before their very eyes. The engineers stand at Stavelot, and the destruction of the fuel depot was a pivotal moment. Piper managed to push a small force through the area, but he had lost the main prize. His column was now fractured, his fuel situation critical. He was forced to turn south into the narrow Amblev Valley, a path that would become his trap. The Americans, now fully alerted, began to close the jaws on Piper Isse Kampfgruppe. They blew bridges in front of him and behind him, boxing him in. Air support, grounded for days by bad weather, finally returned to the skies, mercilessly pounding the trapped German column. Piper's tanks, once a symbol of terrifying power, were now just stationary targets, out of gas and out of time. By Christmas Eve, the situation was hopeless. Piper received orders to break out and save what was left of his command. He had to abandon his vehicles, his prized King Tigers, his Panthers, all of it. He and his remaining men, about 800 of the original 5,000, slipped away on foot, wading through icy rivers and snow-covered forests to get back to German lines. The spearhead of Hitler's great offensive was broken. The story of Stavelot is more than just a battle. It's a powerful lesson in logistics. It proves the old military adage: amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. You can have the best tanks and the most elite soldiers in the world, but without fuel, they are nothing more than 70 tons of useless steel. The 50,000 gallons at Stavelot weren't just fuel. They were the physical embodiment of victory or defeat. The courage of those few engineers who recognized the strategic importance of a fuel dump and were willing to risk everything to destroy it had an impact far beyond their numbers. They didn't win the war on that day, but they slammed the door shut on Germany's last real chance to change its course. It was a victory won not with a bayonet charge, but with a match and a can of gasoline. It was a stark reminder that in the complex machinery of modern warfare, sometimes the most heroic act is one of strategic denial. Imagine the scene. It's December 1944. The German war machine has launched a massive surprise attack through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Spearheading this assault is one of the most feared units on the Western Front, Kampfgruppe Piper, led by the infamous SS officer Joachim Piper. His mission was audacious: punch through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and split the Allied forces in two. But his powerful Panther and Tiger tanks, the pride of the had one crippling weakness: they were incredibly thirsty. Fuel was everything. Without it, this steel behemoth would grind to a halt, turning from a formidable weapon into a sitting duck. The German High Command knew this. Their entire plan was a high-stakes gambling banking on the capture of Allied fuel depots along the way. And the biggest prize of them all was located just outside the Belgian town of Stavelot. This depot, a sprawling facility, contained an astonishing 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. For Piper's fuel-starved tanks, it wasn't just a strategic objective. It was a lifeline. Capturing it would mean his panzers could roll all the way to the Meuse, and perhaps even beyond. Failure meant the end of the road. As Piper's column advanced, it left a trail of destruction. bypassing pockets of American resistance and pushing relentlessly forward. Their speed was terrifying. On December 17th, they rumbled into the small village of near Malmedy, where a horrific event unfolded that would forever stain the name of Piper's Unidad Mamadi massacre. After a brief skirmish, over 100 American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were taken prisoner. They were herded into a field, and then, for reasons still debated by historians, the SS troops opened fire. More than 80 Americans were killed in cold blood. News of this atrocity spread like wildfire through the Allied lines. But it didn't just provoke outrage. It forged an iron resolve. From that moment on, for every American soldier in the Ardennes, stopping Piper became personal. Surrender was no longer an option. The next day, December 18th, Piper's led elements reached the outskirts of Stavelot. The town was lightly defended, mainly by American combat engineers who were ill-equipped to take on heavy tanks. The initial German assault was swift and brutal. Piper's panzers rolled across the vital bridge over the Amblav River and entered the town itself. For a fleeting moment, victory was within his grasp. The colossal fuel depot lay just up the road, tantalizingly close. From his position, he could practically smell the gasoline that would fuel his final push. It seemed like the gamble was about to pay off. But this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Piper, in his haste to maintain momentum and push west towards the Meuse, made a critical and ultimately fatal miscalculation. Instead of immediately securing the entire town and, most importantly, the fuel depot, he left only a small rear guard to hold. He then pressed on with the bulk of his force, heading towards the next town. He assumed the depot was as good as his. He thought he could come back for it later. This was the single greatest mistake of his command. What Piper didn't count on was the sheer grit and ingenuity of the American soldiers he had just pushed aside. While Piper was moving west, American commanders were frantically organizing a counterpunch. Engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, the very same men who had been forced out of Stavelot, were not broken. They were furious. They knew what was at stake. They knew about the massacre. And they knew about the fuel. As darkness fell on the 18th, something incredible happened. While Piper's main body was being stymied at Trois Ponts where other quick thinking American engineers had blown the bridges he needed to cross the Americans launched a fierce counterattack on Stavelot. This wasn't a massive, coordinated assault. It was a desperate, piecemeal effort by determined GIs, tankers, and engineers who were scraped together from nearby units. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation and revenge. The fighting for Stavelot was chaotic and vicious, often devolving into street-to-street, house-to-house combat. The small German rear guard was over. By the morning of December 19th, the Americans had retaken the northern part of the town, crucially cutting off the roads that led directly to the fuel depot. Piper's path back to his prize was now blocked. When news reached Piper that he had lost control of the approaches to the depot, he must have felt a cold dread. He was now miles ahead of his objective, with his fuel gauges dropping precariously low, and the lifeline he had counted on was being defended by an enraged enemy. He immediately turned a portion of his force around and tried to fight his way back into Stavelot. But it was too late. The Americans had been busy. They had reinforced their positions, laid minefields, and set up anti-tank guns covering every approach. When Piper's SS Grenadiers and Panzers tried to retake the town, they were met with a wall of fire. The same streets they had thundered through just a day before were now death traps. The battle raged for hours. Piper's men, elite and battle-hardened, threw themselves at the American lines again and again, but the defenders refused to break. They held the high ground overlooking the town, pouring fire down on the attackers. Meanwhile, a race against time was happening at the depot itself. American engineers, under constant threat of attack, began the monumental task of either evacuating or destroying the fuel. They filled up every truck and jerry can they could find, sending convoys of precious gasoline away from the front lines. What they couldn't move, they prepared to destroy. They doused the massive storage tanks with gasoline and laid demolition charges. The entire area became a ticking time bomb, ready to be turned into a massive inferno at a moment's notice to prevent it from falling into German hands. For the next few days, Piper was trapped. His advance was halted. His supply lines were cut, and the fuel he so desperately needed remained just out of reach, guarded by the indomitable American defenders of Stavelot. His powerful Kampfgruppe, once the tip of the German spear, was now caught in a pocket, surrounded in bleeding strength with each failed attack. His tanks began to run dry, one by one, becoming immobile steel coffins scattered along the frozen roads of the Ardennes. The battle for Gallon 7 was over. Piper had seen the opportunity. He had touched it, but he had let it slip through his fingers. His failure to secure the Stavelot fuel depot was not just a tactical blunder, it was the turning point for his entire operation. Without fuel, his mission was doomed. He and the remnants of his command were eventually forced to abandon their vehicles and escape on foot, their grand offensive having collapsed into a desperate struggle for survival. This incredible episode shows how a major strategic offensive, involving thousands of men and hundreds of tanks, could ultimately be decided by a small group of determined soldiers defending a single, vital objective. The defenders of Stavelot didn't just save 2.5 million gallons of fuel. They saved the Allied front from being broken. They turned the tide in this sector of the Bulge and sealed the fate of Kampfgruppe Piper. It's a powerful testament to the idea that, in war, sometimes the smallest actions can have the largest consequences. History often hinges on the smallest details, the overlooked logistics, the simple lack of a few gallons of fuel. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and often understated chapter of World War II, the story of Gallon 8 and how it crippled the mighty German panzer divisions during the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler launches a desperate, massive surprise offensive, aiming to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. This was the Battle of the Bulge, and leading the charge was Kampfgruppe Piper, a spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Their arsenal was terrifying: the formidable Tiger II, or Keen Tiger, and the agile Panther tanks. On paper, they were unstoppable, but in reality, they had a secret, fatal weakness: their thirst for fuel. These metal beasts were engineering marvels, but they were also Gasgzulers of epic proportions. A Panther tank, for instance, consumed about 7.5 gallons of gasoline per mile on rough terrain. The even heavier Tiger II was worse, getting maybe half a mile to the gallon. Hitler's plan was audacious, but it was built on a knife's edge. He gambled that his panzers could capture Allied fuel dumps along the way to keep their advance moving. It was a high-stakes bet, and the fate of the entire operation depended on it. The plan was code-named Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. The objective for Piper and his tanks was to break through the American lines, cross the Meuse River, and then swing north towards Antwerp. Speed was everything. The entire offensive was designed to be a lightning strike, a blitzkrieg revival. But from the very beginning, things started to go wrong. The American resistance was far stiffer than the Germans anticipated. Small, isolated units of U.S. soldiers, though surprised and often outnumbered, put up a heroic fight. They held crucial crossroads and bridges, causing delays that were measured not just in hours, but in gallons of precious fuel burned while idling or fighting. Every minute Piper's column was stalled. The fuel gauges on his tanks crept closer to empty. The terrain of the Ardennes itself became a formidable enemy. The roads were narrow, winding, and steep. For these 50- and 70-ton tanks, navigating these paths was a nightmare. The winter weather added to the chaos, with snow and ice making the roads treacherous. Imagine trying to steer a massive Tiger II on a slippery, winding mountain pass. It was a slow, fuel-intensive grind. Smithsonian accounts paint a vivid picture of this logistical nightmare. As Piper's column pushed deeper, the bitter irony of their situation became clear. One by one, the mighty tanks began to sputter and die, not from Allied anti-tank guns, but from simple fuel starvation. Powerful, state-of-the-art war machines, worth millions of Reichsmarks, became nothing more than multi-ton roadblocks. Crews faced a heartbreaking choice. Do they stay with their perfectly functional, but immobile, tank, hoping for a fuel truck that might never arrive? Or do they abandon it and continue on foot? Many chose the latter. As Piper's advance continued, it left a trail of abandoned armor, dozens of Panthers and Tigers. Some of the most feared weapons of the war were left sitting on the side of the road, their guns silent, their engines cold. The key to the entire German plan was the capture of Allied fuel depots. Peiper knew there were massive stores of gasoline just a few miles ahead. His radio messages became increasingly desperate pleas for fuel. But the supply lines behind him were stretched thin and constantly harassed by Allied air power. The Luftwaffe promised to provide air cover was nowhere to be seen, thanks to improving weather that allowed Allied fighter bombers to rule the skies. One of the most critical moments came near the town of There was a huge American fuel dump there, containing over 2 million gallons of gasoline. Capturing it would have refueled Peiper's entire Kampfruppe and potentially changed the course of the battle. German commandos managed to enter the town, but American engineers, in a desperate race against time, managed to set the depot ablaze just before it could be seized. Peiper's men watched as their salvation went up in black, acrid smoke. This brings us to the legend of Gallon 8. This wasn't an official military designation, but a term that came to symbolize the critical shortage. It's the idea that the entire massive German offensive, involving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, ultimately failed for want of that last tank of gas. That Gallon 8. It represents the tipping point where mechanical might was rendered useless by logistical failure. Think about the psychological impact on the German soldiers. They were in the most powerful tanks in the world, machines that had dominated battlefields across Europe. Yet, here they were, stranded, forced to abandon their steel protectors because of an empty fuel tank. It was a deeply demoralizing experience. The myth of German invincibility was dissolving not in a blaze of combat glory, but in a quiet, frustrating grind to a halt. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, Peiper's spearhead was completely stalled near a village called La Gla. He was surrounded, cut off, and out of fuel. His tanks were now just static pillars. After holding out for a few more days, he received the order to break out. He was forced to destroy his remaining heavy equipment, including the last of his Tiger II and Panther tanks, and lead his surviving men back on foot through the snow-covered forests. Of the roughly 800 men who started the trek back, only a fraction made it to German lines. The once mighty Kampfruppe Peiper had been shattered, not primarily by Allied firepower, but by the relentless tyranny of the fuel gauge. The failure of Peiper's advance was a microcosm of the failure of the entire Ardennes offensive. Other German units faced the same problems. All across the front, panzers were running dry. The gamble had failed. Hitler's last great offensive in the West was defeated, and a huge part of that defeat can be attributed to the simple, stark reality of logistics. You can have the best tanks in the world, but if you can't fuel them, they are just expensive statues. The story of Gallon 8 is a powerful lesson in military history. It reminds us that wars are not just won by generals and soldiers on the front lines, but also by the quartermasters, the truck drivers, and the planners who manage the unglamorous but absolutely vital flow of supplies. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the lack of fuel proved to be a more effective tank killer than any Allied weapon. It was the silent enemy that brought the German war machine to a final, sputtering halt. In the winter of 1944, the Ardennes forest became the stage for one of World War II's most dramatic gambles, the Battle of the Bulge. This was Hitler's last major offensive in the West, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Central to this plan was a lightning-fast armored thrust, a blitzkrieg reborn. But this grand vision had a fatal flaw, a vulnerability that would unravel the entire operation. It wasn't a failure of courage or a lack of fighting spirit, but something far more fundamental. The German war machine was running on empty. Military analysts, particularly those from the U.S. Army War College, have dissected this campaign for decades. In their journal, Parameters, they point to a glaring disconnect between Germany's strategic ambitions and its logistical capabilities. The plan was audacious, calling for panzer divisions to race across the rugged terrain of the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. This required speed, surprise, and above all, fuel. An immense amount of fuel. The Germans calculated they would need millions of gallons to sustain the advance, but they started the offensive with only a fraction of what was required. This wasn't an oversight, it was a symptom of a much larger disease. By late 1944, Germany's industrial heartland was being relentlessly pounded by Allied bombing. The synthetic oil plants, which had been the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, were primary targets. Production had plummeted. What little fuel could be produced then had to navigate a treacherous journey to the front lines. Allied air power ruled the skies, a concept known as air supremacy. Fighter bombers, nicknamed Jabos by the Germans, prowled the roads and railways, pouncing on any and every target of opportunity. A fuel truck or a tanker train was a prime prize. Every gallon that made it to the front was a small miracle. The German High Command was acutely aware of this problem. Their solution was as desperate as the offensive itself: capture Allied fuel dumps. The entire operational plan was predicated on the assumption that German spearheads would overrun American supply depots, particularly a massive one rumored to be near Stavelot, and refuel their tanks with captured gasoline. This turned the offensive from a calculated military operation into a high-stakes scavenger hunt. Success or failure hinged not just on breaking through enemy lines, but on finding enough gas to keep going. This brings us to the pivotal fight around places like Hansfeld and Stavelot. Here, the tip of the German spear, Kampfgruppe, a formidable armored unit from the 1st SS Panzer Division, pushed deep into American lines. Their advance was terrifyingly fast. They were the key to unlocking the path to the Meuse, but their progress was measured in miles and gallons. As they fogged, their fuel gauges dropped relentlessly. They bypassed pockets of American resistance, always pushing forward, always hunting for that next fuel source. The fighting at Stavelot became a microcosm of the entire battle. American engineers, in a heroic and crucial action, managed to set fire to their own fuel dump before the Germans could capture it. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of gasoline went up in smoke. For the advancing panzers of Kampfgruppe, this was a catastrophe. They could see the black plumes rising into the winter. Ski the very fuel they needed to continue their mission, now burning uselessly. They managed to capture small amounts here and there, but it was never enough. The great prize had been denied. This logistical failure had an immediate and devastating effect. Without fuel, the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks became little more than static pillars. Their advance ground to a halt, not because of overwhelming enemy firepower in every case, but because their engines sputtered and died. Stranded on the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes, they became sitting ducks for Allied counterattacks and airstrikes. The spearhead of the German offensive was blunted, not by a wall of steel, but by an empty fuel tank. The Analysis and Parameters magazine frames this perfectly. The failure at Hansfeld Stavelot wasn't just a tactical setback. It was the inevitable consequence of a strategic vision completely detached from industrial and logistical reality. Germany was attempting to wage a 1940-style mechanized blitzkrieg with a 1944-level supply chain. It was an equation that could never add up. The planners in Berlin drew bold arrows on maps, envisioning a glorious drive to Antwerp, but they couldn't conjure the fuel needed to make those arrows a reality. This critical weakness was present across the entire front. Other German units faced the same predicament. They would make initial gains, punching holes in the American lines, only to find their momentum bleeding away as their supply lines faltered and their fuel ran out. The German soldier fought with tenacity, and their equipment was often technologically superior. But you cannot fight a modern war without logistics. As the old military saying goes, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The Battle of the Bulge is a stark and bloody testament to that truth. The American response, initially caught by surprise, was to bend but not break. Small units, often isolated and outnumbered, fought desperate delaying actions. They blew up bridges, cratered roads, and defended key crossroads with incredible bravery. Every hour they bought was an hour the German panzers were burning precious fuel. These small-scale actions had a massive strategic impact, exacerbating the Germans' logistical nightmare and giving the Allies time to reposition their forces and begin the massive counter-offensive that would ultimately crush the Germans. Looking back, the Battle of the Bulge is often remembered for the siege of the heroism of the 101st Airborne, and General Patton's famous relief effort. But underlying all of that was this fundamental story of fuel. It was a battle won and lost, not just by soldiers and generals, but by the anonymous truck drivers, the railway workers, and the factory laborers, who kept the Allied war machine fueled and running, while their German counterparts could only watch theirs grind to a halt. It highlights a central weakness of the entire German war effort in the later stages of the war. Their initial successes were built on short, sharp campaigns where logistical needs could be carefully managed. But in a prolonged, grinding war of attrition against industrial giants like the United States and the Soviet Union, Germany's own industrial base simply couldn't keep up. The war machine could no longer produce, transport, or protect the vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts required for modern, mechanized warfare on a continental scale. The failure at Hansfeld and Stavelot, therefore, wasn't an isolated incident. It was the moment the strategic bankruptcy of the Third Reich was laid bare on the battlefield. The aggressive, high-risk operational plan was a fantasy, a house of cards built on a foundation of wishful thinking rather than logistical reality. When the first gust of resistance blew and the fuel ran dry, the whole structure came crashing down. The Ardennes offensive, which began with such high hopes for Germany, ended in a frozen forest, with hundreds of abandoned tanks littering the landscape, their fuel tanks empty as silent. Steel graveyard marking the death of Hitler's final gamble. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, the final, desperate gamble of the Third Reich, is underway. The Battle of the Bulge. At the spearhead of this massive offensive is Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the ruthless SS officer Joachim Peiper. His mission: a lightning strike to seize the Meuse River bridges and split the Allied forces. Peiper's column is a fearsome sight. State-of-the-art King Tiger tanks, Panthers, and battle-hardened SS Panzer. They possess unmatched firepower and a fanatical will to win. On paper, they seem unstoppable. But modern warfare runs on more than just steel and fanaticism. It runs on fuel, and Germany was running on empty. From the very start, Peiper's offensive was a race against the fuel gauge. The entire plan hinged on a critical assumption that they would capture Allied fuel depots along their route. This wasn't just a desirable objective. It was a necessity for survival. Without American gasoline, the mighty German panzers would become little more than 70-ton steel statues, stranded in the Belgian countryside. As the offensive began, Peiper's men advanced with terrifying speed, overwhelming American defenses and creating chaos. They captured a small U.S. fuel dump at Bullingen, which gave them a brief reprieve, a temporary lifeline that allowed the advance to continue. But it was just a drop in the ocean compared to what their fuel-guzzling tanks required. Every mile they pushed forward, the fuel gauges crept closer to zero. The tension was immense. The fate of the entire German Western Front rested on their ability to find more fuel and find it fast. Meanwhile, the American forces, though initially caught by surprise, were scrambling to react. They were disorganized and reeling from the initial shock. But they held one crucial advantage: logistics. The Allies had a seemingly endless supply of everything, especially gasoline. While Peiper was desperately hunting for fuel, the Allies were figuring out how to stop him. Small, isolated groups of American soldiers fought with incredible bravery, delaying the German advance at key crossroads and bridges. These weren't elite divisions. They were engineers, cooks, and clerks, men who were suddenly thrown onto the front lines. At places like Stavelot, Tuapens, and La Glaise, these small-scale but heroic stands bought precious time. Every hour of delay was another hour that Peiper's tanks burned through their limited fuel reserves, making them more vulnerable with each passing moment. The German spearhead, once so sharp and deadly, was beginning to dull, not by overwhelming force, but by 1,000 small cuts and the relentless ticking of the clock. Then, the focus shifted to a single, critical location: the Belgian town of Spa. Just a few miles from Peiper's line of advance lay a massive Allied fuel depot. This wasn't just a small collection of it was a colossal reserve containing over 2 million gallons of gasoline. This was the jackpot. If Peiper could capture Spa, his fuel problems would be over. He could refuel his entire Kampfgruppe and continue his blitzkrieg all the way to the Meuse River and beyond. The entire Battle of the Bulge, and perhaps the war on the Western Front, balanced on this one single point: capturing Spa would reinvigorate the German offensive. Failing to do so would mean certain death for the spearhead. The Americans knew this too. Defending Spa became their absolute top priority. The race was on, a desperate struggle between a German panzer column running on fumes and a frantic American effort to protect their most vital asset. The task of defending this critical fuel depot fell to the U.S. First Army's engineers. They weren't frontline combat troops, but they understood the strategic importance of what they were guarding. As Piper's forces drew dangerously close, a daring and drastic plan was put into motion. They couldn't risk the fuel falling into enemy hands. So, they opened the taps. Engineers began systematically pumping the precious gasoline directly into the Amblave River. Gallons upon gallons of high-octane fuel poured into the water, turning the river into a flammable stream. They also began evacuating as many fuel trucks as they could, sending them speeding away from the approaching Germans. It was a scorched earth policy, a calculated sacrifice, better to destroy the fuel themselves than to let it power the enemy's war machine. As German scouts got close enough to see the depot, they were met with a demoralizing sight of their prize, literally going down the drain. The smell of gasoline filled the air, a scent of victory for the Allies, and a scent of bitter failure for the Germans. Piper's last hope was being washed away, with the fuel at Spa destroyed and their path blocked at key bridges by determined American defenders. The momentum of Kampfgruppe Piper finally broke. The advance ground to a halt, not in a massive tank battle, but in a quiet, sputtering demise. One by one, the fearsome King Tigers and Panthers ran out of gas. They were abandoned on the narrow roads of the Ardennes, their crews forced to retreat on foot. The once mighty armored spearhead was now just a trail of abandoned, useless steel. Piper and his remaining men were surrounded in the village of La Glaise, a pocket of resistance, with no hope of escape or reinforcement. After days of holding out, facing annihilation, Piper made the decision to abandon his vehicles and escape on foot, back through the American lines. Of the nearly 4,000 men who started the offensive with him, only about 800 made it back. They left behind a graveyard of the most advanced tanks in the world, defeated not by superior armor or firepower, but by an empty fuel tank. The failure of Kampfgruppe Piper to capture the Allied fuel supplies was more than just a tactical setback. It was a perfect illustration of Germany's fatal flaw throughout the later stages of the war. They had brilliant engineers who designed incredible weapons like the King Tiger tank, and they had disciplined, elite soldiers to operate them. They had bold and aggressive commanders like Piper. What they didn't have was the industrial and logistical capacity to sustain a modern, mechanized war. An army, no matter how brave or well-equipped, cannot advance without fuel. Courage can't fill a gas tank, and elite training doesn't make a panther run on water. The entire Ardennes offensive was a desperate gamble, built on the hope of capturing enemy supplies. When that gamble failed, the entire offensive was doomed. It was a hard lesson in the realities of modern warfare. Logistics is an unjust part of the war. Think about the irony. Germany, the nation that pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg lightning war based on rapid mechanized advances, was ultimately defeated by its inability to supply its own machines. The Allies, on the other hand, demonstrated the true meaning of military might. It wasn't just about having the best tanks, it was about having the ability to build tens of thousands of them, ship them across an ocean, and keep them supplied with a seemingly infinite river of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. This was the arsenal of democracy in action. The image of a King Tiger tank, the pinnacle of German engineering, abandoned and useless on a muddy Belgian road simply because it ran out of gas, is one of the most powerful symbols of why the Allies won World War II. It's a testament to the fact that battles are won by soldiers, but wars are won by logistics. The story of Kampfgruppe Piper and the hunt for gasoline is a crucial chapter in the history of the Battle of the Bulge. It shows how a single, seemingly mundane resource can determine the outcome of a major battle and shape the course of history. It highlights the incredible bravery of the American soldiers, many of them non-combat troops, who stood their ground and made the critical decisions that thwarted the German plan. And ultimately, it serves as a stark reminder that in the complex machine of modern warfare, the most powerful weapon of all might just be a full tank of gas. The German war machine didn't just run out of road in the Ardennes, it ran out of fuel, and with it, it ran out of time. This story of strategy, desperation, and logistics is just one of many that unfolded during the brutal winter of 1944. There are countless other tales of heroism and sacrifice that deserve to be told. If you found this deep dive into the Battle of the Bulge interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that goes beyond the headlines of history. We love exploring the details that truly define these epic conflicts. Let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like us to cover. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.